Hey guys, Alexander here. Mostly making this for myself just to keep a record of what I'm thinking about the format. But hey, if someone enjoys it, that'd be great. What I want to talk about today is the power format, is the power ranking of the game plan for draft archetypes in Edge of Eternity. I'm not talking about the power level of the cards in those archetypes in those colors. You know, we know that there's strong cards which can make any game plan work if they're powerful enough. From the Final Fantasy, blue red, 4 cost spells didn't sound great until you add a Shantoto, and suddenly that's a very powerful archetype. But I'm more talking about the general game plan. Is it something you want to be doing in Limited, or does it require very powerful cards but very good enablers, payoffs, etc.? I think you'll understand more once I get into talking about this. So, jumping in, our first archetype is Second Spell. That's blue white. This gets a D. Second Spell, that's normally more of an Is It archetype where you're casting multiple spells in a row. We saw that in Tarkir with Flurry, and while it can work, it struggles so heavily. Most Flurry decks didn't really pay off, and when they did, they were on the backs of very powerful cards, which, the dude making a free 1/1 every time you Flurry, that was a great enabler, but the archetype itself, if you didn't get those cards, if you didn't get, 5 mana spell that generated 3 mana, suddenly your game plan fell apart. I don't think blue white's going to do very well here. It's just too easy to disrupt. You're spending too many resources on refilling your hand. The one thing that might pull it up is Warp. Warp's going to inherently allow you to cast a spell and sort of draw the same spell later on as a unit. I don't think it'll be good enough though. You're generally going to either be, if you're warping into double spell, that means you're playing either 2 warp cards, so there's going to be no units coming into play with 2 cards being cast. That's bad. Double spelling, you want to be putting things on the board normally, putting rectangles on the board. Whereas, you might warp in 1 card and then play a cheap creature, but then, it's turn 4 and you're getting a 2 mana ETB and a 2 mana creature, which is fine, but I'd rather just play a 4 mana creature. Mana in Magic tends to get exponentially better, right? 2/2 drops are not as inherently powerful as a 4 drop. You're just getting 2 bodies out of it. With Warp, you're not. So I don't think Warp's likely to bolster this second spell archetype enough for it to feel good. So I'm just gonna we'll give it a D plus because Warp, but it's unlikely. Blue-black, artifact control. This is probably decent. It's control's good. Artifact specific control can be rough just because you do need the artifacts running around. You need, if it's artifact synergies, then you're adding this extra requirement into a control deck, whereas control decks already want removal spells heavily, and those are going to be contested. But this set also has lander tokens. Lander tokens are going to be giving you some really good artifact ETBs, if, assuming there's things which care about ETBs on artifacts, care about how many artifacts you control. Landers are going to be a very easy way to get that. while also giving you some late game power by ramping you up and removing lands from your deck, which may actually come into play this set with how many ramp options there are. So overall, I'm gonna give it like, I'll give it a C+. I think it'll be better than just generic control. I think this set is set up. There's also Void, which needs to be mentioned for black. Void, I think, will make or break several archetypes here, but this one, blue-black, seems like where you're going to really want that Void, really want to, have lander tokens in play, sacrifice it, activate your Void, you get major benefits. So I'm going to give that one a C+ there. Speaking of Void, red-black Void, with Void being the centerpiece. I'm honestly less eager for this. I think Void, it depends heavily on what the Void decks are doing. This is going to be very dependent on the cards themselves, but the idea of having your deck revolve around losing your own creatures, losing your own artifacts, that tends not to work very well. We see some of that in Orzhov, but Orzhov typically is very go wide and very heavy on reanimates, which if you're reanimating, that gives you a lot more benefit to the self-sacrifice archetype. I think Void by itself, there's going to be too many times where you have to play suboptimally in order to trigger it. So I'll give it a C-. I think it's better than second spell. There's, Void is not completely new, but I haven't played with a similar mechanic, so I might be misjudging how difficult it is to trigger. C- for Void. Don't love being in it, but I'll go into it if it's available. Red-green, Landers and Landerfall. I think this is going to be pretty good. Ramping is generally a good thing. Green is normally in ramping anyway, but having both ramping and landfall, the biggest issue with landfall is you can't necessarily get the lands, right? You get your landfall dudes in play, you get your landfall artifacts, your enchantments, everything's set up, and then you're reliant on drawing a land to trigger them, but at the same time, if you draw a land, you're not drawing a spell, and that's bad. With Landers, you can cast a spell, do whatever effects it has, might just give you a small creature or something, but it'll also get you a land out of your deck. So I think that combination is going to be really helpful. It also makes it really easy to trigger landfall multiple times in a turn. Landers, you can spend 4 mana, get 2 lands, in addition to the land you play for your land for turn. That's pretty easily getting 3 landfall triggers, which can really push through a ton of effects when your opponent isn't ready for it. You could do similar things with ramp spells in the past, but those spells tend to fall flat because they were purely ramp, and purely ramp spells aren't doing enough in limited. You're spending 4 mana, getting 2 lands, and you haven't affected the board at all. If you are in late game and you just need any creature, that's very common, you just need a chump blocker even, you draw a ramp spell, you're going to be pretty sad. If you draw a 1/1 that makes a lander, you'll be happy. So I'm going to give it tentatively a B-. Holy shit, G-Hub, shut up. Finally, we have Selesnya at the bottom of the first column. +1/+1 counters. This just sounds good. It's not as good as generically large creatures. I'm thinking of OTJ had mounts, which were really just big, beefy creatures that could have an added effect tacked onto them. +1/+1 counters aren't quite as good because they need you to put investment into whatever creatures you're putting the counters on. But the basic idea of put stats on the board, I can't complain. I'll also give this one a B minus. Actually, no, I'm going to lower it to C plus, just because you can end up in a situation where you over-index on one creature and then it gets hit by a removal spell, and now your entire game plan falls apart. So still good, but not as good. I'd rather be, in Landfall, which has more going for it and isn't as vulnerable, I don't think, to being disrupted. Black, white, go wide. That sounds good. This is, traditionally this would be Boros, which I'm noticing there's a lot of archetypes which seem to be mixed up compared to before. Second spell would normally be Is It, not Azorius. We've got Go Wide and Orzhov instead of Boros. Kind of interesting. We'll see how that turns out. But yeah, I think Go Wide is just exactly something you want to be doing, especially in black Go Wide. Black tends to have good removal spells, so does white, which means you can get rid of the big dude that's blocking your guys from attacking in efficiently, and then just swarm your opponent. I'm giving this a B+, honestly. It might, again, depends on the strength of the cards, but if you ask me what I want to be doing, my answer is I want to put a bunch of units on the board and kill my opponent. Is it artifact aggro? This one doesn't sound great. It depends on the artifacts themselves. We saw, if you think about Final Fantasy, we saw some blue-white artifact aggro decks come out where, you had the one drop that summons more of itself, the infantry. You had a couple of flyer artifacts, a couple of artifacts which created tokens, but without job select, I think playing artifacts, they better be artifact creatures at the very least. And even then, if you're spending, cards have a power budget, right? And if you're spending power budget on being an artifact and having artifact synergies, you're not spending power on just killing your opponent. And aggro decks need to kill your opponent really quickly, otherwise they're going to be outvalued. So trying to shoehorn those together, especially if you play an artifact which doesn't make a unit, that's going to just stop your aggro tempo right in its tracks. So I'm going to give this, I'll give it a C minus. Aggro gets a bump just because a decent aggro deck can get through bad matchups because you're less likely to brick. You're not, relying on the perfect sequence of cards typically, so if it really is aggro, then you can get it through against land-flooded opponents, you can get through against mana-screwed opponents, that's increasing your win rate a bit, but it's not sounding exciting. Black-green graveyard, this is a classic. It's normally not great. It relies really heavily on having things you want to recur, and I have to give it a D+. I'll give it a D+, because there's times when it's been great, but we've seen it before. Really, it's heavily dependent on having better cards than your opponent, and if you have better cards than your opponent, then you could really just be in any opponent, or in any archetype. If any archetype with stronger cards is going to win. Graveyard isn't inherently a good strategy to be doing. Uh, Red-white space stations. This is probably the worst that I'm seeing. Red-white is traditionally this go wide aggro strategy, which you're trying to keep up with tempo, kill your opponent before they can turn the corner. Spacecraft go completely against that. So I don't think the whole idea of spacecraft is likely to keep you in the game. You're playing a spacecraft, and this is all stuff that people have talked about repeatedly, but playing a spacecraft that isn't a unit and then trying to crew it, which means tapping your existing units, that doesn't sound like a good time. That sounds like you're just begging to end up in a situation where you need your blockers, and so you can't crew your space station, so now your entire deck is falling apart because you have this expensive rectangle you put on the board that doesn't actually do anything. If your creatures are large enough to crew your space station quickly, then I'd rather just play large creatures and hit with them. Not, this kind of crew mechanic, except it's so much worse than crew because crew was instant speed. Space stations are sorcery speed. If you crew something and then your unit dies, I don't think you even get the crew power. So it's just absurdly slow in what's normally a faster paced deck, right? You look at what it shares colors with. Go wide doesn't work too well with crewing a space station. Second spell, I guess, kinda could, but I think you're really going to want warp. If warp is powerful, then both second spell and space station go up. But I don't think warp sounds great. Getting that ETB and then losing the creature doesn't sound amazing. So for now, I'm just gonna give it a D-. I think space stations sound like the worst of the bunch. And then finally, we have classic ramp. There's not too much to say. I think I've heard people commenting about how we don't have much fixing, but it's important to remember all of the lander tokens, I should say, ramp tokens, are inherently fixing because they can find you basics for your colors. So I think you're going to be a lot more able to do what you typically expect, which is play a ramp deck and then really splash in a couple of bombs from other colors. Go ahead, do that. I think it just gets a C though. It's a classic archetype that's normally pretty mediocre, but if you can get the right cards for it, it can go off. Fill your deck with bombs and then be able to play them. That's always a good thing. So, wow, that doesn't work? Okay, fine. Overall, I don't think any of these archetypes stand out as, oh man, these are so great. These are, exactly what I want to be doing in Limited. But that's going to be rare. That's why I consider A's are, if there's a archetype which I look at and say, this sounds exactly like what I want to do. If there was just for me personally, if there was, a control heavy deck, which, unit-based control or something, that'd be an A because those are two things you really want. Nothing here meets the bar. Couple of really awful ones, space stations, second spells. But yeah, overall I'd say Landerfall looks good, Go Wide looks good. Try to stay away from, those D's, the Graveyard, mediocre. Of course, if there's good reanimate spells, if there's good bombs. Cloud of Darkness was a crazy card for some of the Final Fantasy drafts in general. Final Fantasy had a lot of powerful bombs, so if you were recurring Primal Odins, graveyards were good. But yeah, this is just my thoughts on the game plan that Wizards wants the deck to have, and whether that game plan is enough to pull through by itself, or if it needs to have higher quality cards than the rest of the archetypes. Hopefully someone gets something out of this. Hopefully I don't come back to this 2 months from now and say, holy shit, I was completely wrong about all of this. I'm certain I'll come back and think that I was a complete idiot for ignoring how one of these mechanics would play out. But either way, have a great day and thanks for watching.